caves before? How many of us knew all the big words that were in our caves?
We had done research of them.
And just so I know for myself, how many of you are just doing Parley? Just Parley. All right. Who wants to describe the differences between a parliamentary K and an LDK? Yeah.
Parley K is allowed and an LDK is against the rules.
That's a fair statement. So the LDK, the rules basically say that you're not allowed to offer an alternative / counter plan, however you want to phrase that, that changes the form of government or changes the actor. Kind of excludes a lot of Ks. It's really hard to find a K with an alternative that doesn't do one of those two things. If I reject the AF, I'm pretty much saying I reject whatever sort of state democracy that the AF is saying, right? Means there's probably no longer a K. Is there any other difference between a Parley and an LD? I would say evidence. I mean, that's pretty basic, but I think that there's a lot to be said about Parley not being able to read evidence about authors talking about these things, right? So you being able to answer a lot of these questions means that in Parley, you're able to be a lot more tricky with your K than you are in LD, right? So you should think about that when you do that, or when you write your K. So for today, I thought we'd, because I imagine we're all at a lot of different points in our K experiences, so I thought a lot of today would be a lot of foundational work about what your K does and some of the key words that you should probably know and be able to answer in cross-ex. So we've probably all heard that the K is a disad and counterplan put together. That's kind of true. What's the difference between a disad and the top part of a K? Has to do with the uniqueness. There is no uniqueness in a K. Where do we find the uniqueness in the K?
Framework.
Kinda. The uniqueness is in the alternative. Let's take the cap K, for instance. The first card or first argument you meet in the cap K is to say that the U.S. economy is based off capitalism, right? It's sort of an assumed state. You make that assumption when you read the alternative that says we should turn away from capitalism. I was one of these people for a long time. It's cheating. You're not really questioning what my app is talking about. You're talking about some other ism that I don't think that the app addresses. It could be cheating, could not be cheating. And LD appears to be cheating. And it's all about isms. So what are some different types of Ks that you've heard?
Marxism.
Marxism, it's a cap K.
Feminism.
Feminism.
Environmentalism.
Environmentalism. Racism.
Queer ecology.
Yeah, it's also okay. Most of these things have the end of an ism, right? So if you hear an argument ran against you, you're not really sure if it's a K or not, you think it's a disad, you think they ran a counterplan. If they appear to use the word ism, good chance it's a K. It's a good way to identify them. And it's about philosophy, right? It's about the underlying assumptions of the app. So here's how I came up with what it really is. First, it's a philosophical disad with a counterplan, sort of, but not really. Counterplans are policy options, right? You just heard a lecture from Stu about all the different types of counterplans that could happen. The only one that was mentioned that could possibly fall under an alternative would be the utopian, which even she said is basically ran with a K. It's about the overt assumptions of the app. What does that mean? Any ideas? What kind of assumptions do apps make that critiques criticize?
Capitalism's good.
Capitalism's good.
Patriarchy's good.
Patriarchy's good. I don't know.
Something to be exploited.
The environment's meant to be exploited. So the overt assumptions of the app, they don't say these things, right? We assume that mining on the moon would be good because there's a chance of being able to save us from environmental destruction. But in reality, what we're doing is we're causing environmental damage other places. The app doesn't say that. It's an assumption made by the app that the critique is trying to flush out of them, make them be able to justify that. Yeah.
So the K is about the overt assumption of the F?
Yes.
Okay. So
It's
not. That's why I was like, what?
Just make sure.
Wait, this one. Let me just let it have a
Right.
The K is about the overt assumptions of the F. If the affirmative team cannot answer the question about those assumptions, you should not be running that case. If you cannot say why environmentalism, or if your AF causes environmental destruction, but why that, if your AF says environmental destructionism, right, that's happening on Earth, you should be able to prove why causing environmental destructionism on the moon is superior to that. Right? You want to be able to prove and answer that question when they ask you, why is it okay to cause damage on the moon? Well, the Earth is more important. If they say, why do you think capitalism is so good? You should have a case prepared about why capitalism causes all these really great things in society. Along with that, it's the philosophical lens or method through which the critics can view an artifact, concept, idea, action, thing in the world. A doing, not a thing. So, what the K really does is it offers the judge an opportunity to view the debate in a different round. Most AFs that you will run up against will make the assumption of utilitarianism. What is utilitarianism?
The greatest good for the greatest amount of people.
Yeah. In Parleyran, that's basically net benefits. How many lives do I save compared to how many lives do you save? The K is not interested in that. The K offers a judge through a different lens about how we should be saving people. Most of the time you'll hear this as a dehumanization argument. And this is why Ks get tricky, right? A good K team will say, my dehum argument is the thing that leads to your destruction. That's not always the case, right? If that happens, where does the debate now need to take place at? On that question. The rest of the debate doesn't matter at that point. Well, that's not true. The rest of the debate is less important than you answering the question about which framework should the judge view the debate around. Because if you don't win that question, there's no chance of you being able to win the round. Right? You could win 95% of the rest of the K debate. But if you don't answer the question about which view the judge should take at the end of the round, you're pretty much screwed. I guess that's fine. Let me cut this off for time purposes. So I think these are the key terms that you should know for any kind of K. Because all Ks kind of fall under one of these three categories. The first is epistemological. I think the key thing is here, it's the way you know equals the way you act. Epistemology is all about knowledge. How did you come to know the things in the world? All right. So let's take the cap K, for instance. The way that I know, or the reason that I wrote my app the way that I did, saying that capitalism was good, was because I learned that through behavior. Right? And those actions and that belief are what caused me to write this app. Why I want to save Earth compared to the moon. The way that I know about the Earth and the knowledge I have about the Earth that I've attained says that I should care more about the Earth than I should about the moon. A lot of these have to do with identity and racism critiques. Right? The over-assumptions about whiteness that takes the other, that does not take the other into account. Does everyone know what the other is?
You can explain it. Just quick.
Does anyone else have, you want to try and explain it?
It's who's on the outside of the group you identify with.
Right. The other is the person that is not you. It's a very self-focused thing. The other could be anything, right? But a lot of the time we talk about the other in terms of identity politics. How you identify with it. Ontology. Ontological. Ontology is about being. Anyone familiar with Heidegger? A lot of Heidegger critiques deal with ontology. How can I act upon something until I know myself? Right? How do you know that thing actually exists? Ontology critiques are very difficult to be able to debate against because the team will be very tricky. The epistemology and the ideology critiques are kind of overt in their descriptions of those things, right? You said capitalism was good, even though you didn't say capitalism good, but it's really bad. Ontology critiques ask you, why should we go to the moon if we don't even know if the moon exists? That's how I've always framed ontology debates. Other questions about ontology are sort of more self-reflexive. For a lot of Heidegger critiques, they'll ask you to rethink before you act, right? What's the problem with that? Having to think about something until you act.
That's what you're doing right now.
There's no bright line. What I mean by bright line is, I can continue to think about going to the moon forever. At what point have I thought enough before I decide to go there? Ks have a really hard time answering that question, right? Because in reality, the case says we should probably never go to the moon. But if you want to gain access, you should probably press them on that issue. And ideology. A lot of these have to do with ideas of like democracy or capitalism, sort of how we frame the world. Application of capitalism, distribution of freedom, equality, fairness, a better. So ideologies sort of fall into both of those categories as well. And a lot of the same rules apply. Any question about epistemology, ontology, or ideology? When you run a K, you should kind of try and figure out which way you lean on these issues.
Should you label it as such? Like, should you be like, this was an epistemology?
I don't think that's necessary.
Okay.
I think that you probably give the AF more answers that way in terms of how they should be framing their answers. That's not necessary. You should make it up the AF to be able to figure it out. You should know, and that's sort of a trump card that you can play in your last speech, right? And sort of your explanation of how the K functions. But I don't think you need to give that answer to the AF until they ask it. So, critiques start off with a link. If you're the AF, these are probably the hardest thing for you to be able to beat. Links fall under 4 different categories. The first is a link to the state, right? Anything that has to do with the United States federal government, bad. Right, so the fact that the word USFG should, or your actor should, if you're topical, you probably fall under a branch of government. It's a pretty easy link to make, right? It's really hard to no link out of an argument in which your plan is based off of. Which can also put you in a devil's line, right? You don't want to debate the case, you do a non-topical AF, right? Now you're debating T. Links to the plan text or the action itself that's not the United States federal government. These also fall under sort of the language links, but not necessarily. These are things like, you've identified mining as something that we should do, which is part of the resolution. I'm sure there is authors out there who talk about the word mining or the act of mining as being bad from an ideological, ontological, or epistemological standpoint. These are also hard to beat, right? Your answers will fall under things like, no, mining's good. But it's going to be really hard to no link out of something like mining because it's part of what your plan is. Links to the advantages. These are easier for the app to be able to no link out of because the app gets to answer them trickily with internal link arguments. But links to advantages are things like, you talk about nuclear destruction. Talking about nuclear destruction only leads to more nuclear destruction. You talk about global warming. Talking about global warming only perpetuates more people to act as a global warmer. I just made that word up. I think it's pretty good. Any hedge advantage that you run is K fodder. Why? Why is hedge get K debaters jumping for joy?
Because there are a lot of inherent characteristics that are easily criticizable.
Yes. Overt actions by the AF, right? World policing comes from a very white paradigm. These are all things from a patriarchal standpoint. These are all things that are very easily linked. Most apps run hedge because it's the easiest thing to be able to get a lot of different impacts to. It's really easy to say why military readiness is good and find internal links to that. There's lots of them on the moon topic. Getting a space station up there, being able to have war domination. Those are really good if you're in a policy versus policy round. They're very hard to beat when you're in a K, against the K. This was a quote from Tony Nielsen, who's the head of Model now. Please, universe, just grant me one hedge advantage. That's what most K debaters like to think. Language links. These are things like dirty words. A thing that we can say is so powerful that we must take a stand, draw an epistemological line in the sand so that we will not know the world through that language. The trick here is to learn the K language to be able to beat the K. I can't think of it. Like, there's dirty words are people who talk about a specific word that you used somewhere within your evidence.
Like terrorist.
Like terrorist. A lot of these have to do with then identifying that when you use the word terrorist, you're putting them off in the corner and making them the other. Right? Here's a trick when you're AF. The first person to say dirty word is the one who's actually the one who's using the dirty word. Language is just language until someone puts meaning behind that word. You're the one who's telling me those things. That's not true. That's not how I meant it. It's a common response. The other answer to language links are to say it comes from the literature, which is more of an LD answer. Right? But I think that you can probably get away with this from Parley, too. I think that if your answer is simply, listen, when I did research about this K, pre-REM, the literature base uses these words. I can't not use those words. Right? Any questions about the links? Yeah.
Would an example be using you guys for a language link, or is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the real distinguisher between the link to the plan text with like the word mining versus like a language link? Because wouldn't that plan text, the mining one, be kind of the dirty word?
I think that the difference between those two is mining is more of like a verb,
Okay.
right? It's like more of an action. It's overt compared to language links, where what are the assumptions made when you use that word?
Okay.
So, for instance, when you use "you guys," that's not necessarily mining bad. It's you using the word "you guys" continues the patriarchy.
Okay.
Yeah.
On the like specific of the language link one, can it be something on like a performative stance where like a lot of people I remember last year realized be like, silence is consent, meaning that if they didn't respond to this, and then I heard someone run like a K on it where they're like, well look, you saying silence is consent like basically propagates rape culture and whatnot. So like
I
on
haven't heard that one before. But
yeah, it was the weirdest thing where I was like, is that allowed? I wasn't really clear on it.
Yeah, I mean, you did an action, and the K will find a way to be able to link.
But since it's not like necessarily their plan, but rather their actual performance in the
Yeah, I
debate,
think you said something that I probably should have added because that's new, but performance links. Right, so there used to be there's K's running at speed a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's what.
Right, so that's a performance link. Something that the app did when they performed the act of speaking can also be a link. I haven't heard the silence for this. It's interesting. Anything else on this? Second card that you will read, since the second argument you will meet will be impactless. He's one of those normally turned case. Any idea how they normally do this? We sort of talked about it at the beginning. Just things like D comes before your impact, right? Or you perpetuating capitalism causes more destruction. Capitalism breeds destruction. Or you thinking that you save the environment through this lens actually causes more harm to the environment. Other things are your continued idea that you are the supreme leader of the world, which allows you to act this way, causes more nuclear war. It's basically a turns case argument. Zizek talks a lot about that from the evidence I used to read. Rights, humanness, and violence are basically the most common, I would say, besides turn case, and a lot of those are turns case arguments. Is it better to be alive or not be treated as human? Now you can ponder that for a second. A lot of my debates that I used to have came down to that question. They often say they're a prereq to the AF impacts. We must consider them as people before we can kill them. It's the same question about does your AF treat people as a non-human as the other? Often say outweighs AF impacts because these are worse than death. Also more of a turn K. A lot of the K impacts sound the same, they just use different language. They basically boil down to either you treat people inhumanely, which allows you to cause violence to them, or your impact or your plan to be able to solve your impact actually is the thing that's causing the impact. Those are the two most basic generic answers to that impact. Yeah.
So if I were to say, if my opponent said my impact or their impact is nuclear war, and I said, well, my impact of dehumanization causes your impact, that's a K, not an impact analysis type thing?
It just depends. So that argument is run both from a policy standpoint and from a critical standpoint. If you try and have that debate with a critical team, it's probably not in your favor, right? I think we ran that last year.
Yeah.
Right. So on Chico, we ran a dehum impact. Do you remember what the internal link was?
No.
Or you're talking about the debate app?
Yeah.
Internal.
Critical
Oh, the
thinking.
critical, yeah.
More people should be critical thinkers, and our plan does that. But things like a capitalism critique, which causes dehumanization, probably gets there better than us being able to go for critical thinking. Just an example. Alternatives. Probably the weakest part of the K. Something that you should be able to attack. I find that when someone runs a K, they don't necessarily need to be able to win their alternative to be able to win the K. Why is that true? What we talked about earlier was the K is basically a dissent in the counterclaim debate. It's like losing the counterclaim debate, but still losing to the dissent. Right? Politics dissent with the state's counterplan, you can still lose on the politics dissent. And that means you lose the right. This also provides uniqueness. We talked about that. So there's two different ways the alternative can do. Boils down to, it can do some things. It's okay, this is what we should do action. Or it can go no things, which is reject or do nothing. So some things would be, we should have a shift in the way in which we view or act in state politics. A lot of feminism critiques say that we should not use the male thought process in making decisions, and instead we should take a more feminist approach. Right, so this is more, those authors talk about things like more conversations, less action. It can also do the no things, which is reject or do nothing. What does do nothing mean in the context of a K? Does it mean we just sit on our hands in the living room on the couch?
Presumably.
Could mean that. This is why you should know what your author's talking about when they talk about do nothing. It also means that you should have an answer to this question about what it means to do nothing. It could mean just sitting on the couch and doing
Keep the status quo the
nothing.
same.
It could mean to keep the status quo the same.
Don't do plan.
Don't do plan. That's kind of reject. Yeah. Reject is more of a, I think, a more aggressive stance. Right? It's your plan specifically that is going to be able to cause these things. We must reject it in every instance. Every instance of capitalism we must reject. Every instance of environmental destruction we must reject. So, we got like 20 minutes left. I think we have 15 minutes left. All right. So here's some common answers to the case. Link terms. You said capitalism. I think capitalism is good. I think these are pretty easy to be able to make. I think they're usually pretty strong. And they're offensive. Finding the delicate balance between offensive and defensive arguments when answering a K, I've always found to be the most challenging. Going all defensive, not a very good strategy. Going all offensive, not a very good strategy. Finding time to be able to make the correct of both arguments, definitely difficult. You can also try and prove that there's no link. Sometimes this is harder than there are other times. Language links, you can try and prove a no link. Right? Do you think that you can make a no link argument on capitalism? Someone runs a cap K. Can you run a no link argument?
Saying we're not actually capitalists.
Bingo. You can say, even though we function inside of a capitalistic society, my app does not follow the same model that your author is talking about. Or your model does not, my model of capitalism does not follow the same model that your critique is trying to link me to. It is not this overt, for-profit continuation of growth. All right? This is where the app gets to be tricky. Answering the K allows you to be able to spin your app any way that you want. I think this gets dropped by a lot of app teams, right? Where they just want to stick to what their app says at its most basic level. Just like the K gets to be tricky when they get to go up and give their responses about what the alternative actually looks like. You get to give responses about what your app actually looks like. You get to describe your utopia. The easiest way, I think, to be able to get rid of the counterplan is to prove that it fails. Doesn't have solvency. Does rejecting my app actually cause us to no longer have capitalism in the world? No, it doesn't. Capitalism will still reign supreme. Or just because we stop having capitalism in the United States does not mean that we will not have capitalism in other countries. Doing some things like having a paradigm shift also seem very difficult to be able to prove that we'll do. Right? If you're trying to convince everybody that they should change their minds, it seems like we're going to have a hard time being able to do that, to be able to actually have the shift. A lot of time frame questions come into this. How long does it take us to be able to completely do away with capitalism tendencies? Permutations. Not on the board. Should always make a permutation. What do you think the permutation looks like on a reject the app? It looks a lot like the no link argument does. Is you being able to spin your plan versus the alternative. Right, so if the alternative is to reject capitalism in every instance, you can make the same answer you made on the no link as a reason for why the permutation succeeds. you're right. We should reject the form of capitalism that you're talking about in every instance, which is why my plan's okay, and there's no competition between the two things. Because I've taken a stance against capitalism by doing something slightly different than the model of what you're describing. Another common permutation answer is perm do the plan first, then the counterplan. There's some theoretical reasons why you shouldn't do this, but I think it's a very good permutation. Any ideas why?
Well, for example, with like a cap K, you could say, you know, the change that we need away from capitalism needs to be gradual, save the most lives. So we should stop the model from within, or, you know, like it'll burn all the buildings down if we just reject
Yeah,
it.
it comes down to your AF is supposed to save a bunch of lives, right? Your AFs are all going to be, if we don't do my specific plan, the sun's going to blow from global warming. Or if we don't do my specific plan, we're going to go to war with Russia, and that's going to happen way faster than your paradigm shift about capitalism. So we should do my plan first, and then reject every other instance. Any other answers to cases you want to talk about that you've heard before? Yeah.
What about like make link harder type?
Yeah, that's an answer where the alternative doesn't solve because it links right back into the K itself. I think that you should be able to take that a step farther. If that's the case, and their alternative, which they got to dream up and do, and their author talk about, links back into their own critique, that probably means there's never a way to solve, which means there's no harm to be done by doing my plan. Does that make sense? Any other random K questions that you've had a hard time being able to answer in the past? In a second to answer those. What are some common parliamentary Ks? Because I'm not familiar. The people that
Cap is
Cap
kind of
is,
common.
cap is pretty common. Eco-fem is making a resurgence.
Yeah.
How do you normally respond to the cap K?
Cap good.
Bunch of impact terms.
No link. Or I've tried to like perm the framework, do the plan, like just the same idea, like the do the plan first kind of thing, like, but not actually doing the alternative at all, but to like perm the framework, but say that we should adopt this gradual mindset, like a gradual change kind of response or something like that.
It's really good. Actually, segues, I think. Yes, framework. Who wants to tell me what framework is? Yeah.
It's like the philosophical underpinning of what you do and how you think.
I think about framework as its own argument that probably deserves its own piece of paper. And it has to do with the rules of debate and the lens in which the judge should view the round. I like to keep these arguments separated from the K argument because I think that it gets really messy on the K flow otherwise. So, framework is where you'd have the debates about util versus the ontology, right? The philosophical debates. This is also where the AF team gets to say AF choice. This is also where the app gets to read all of their consequentialism cards or make consequentialism arguments. Every action that we take or do not take has consequences. This is also where you get to read some of your theory arguments about why reading the K is dirty and bad. For ULDers, it's something like LD rules say you probably should have picked a different alternative. You should reject the team because they're killing my education by being dirty, rotten cheaters. I think the framework, the most important argument that everyone can make, is that links of omission are bad. You should be able to prove a specific link to my specific plan for you to be able to prove this. It's what we ask you to do when you run a counter plan. It's what we ask you to do when you run a DA. It's what we even ask you to do when you run top account. Is to be my plan specific. If you're not able to do that, you've killed the education in this round because we're no longer having a conversation about my app. or the specific should we or should we not do this. We're having more generic conversations about utilitarianism. That seems like a silly debate to have over and over and over again. Instead, if you want to talk about that, we should talk about it in the context of what my app actually does. Make them make a specific argument about your app if you're Parley. Make them read a specific card if you're LD. I think this also gets you a certain degree in favor of the judge by saying, did you do pre-round work or did you not do pre-round work? Was this something you had in your back file, or was this something that you actually are continuing to work on? That might be more of a me preference, though. Yeah.
How specific does this link evidence need to be? Because that it could be unreasonable to say you have to have a specific link for this specific plan. Like how specific do you need this?
Well, take the mining example. I think that if someone's going to read a mining link against you, I think that it should be moon specific. But this is just my preference. I should clarify that. But I think the more specific you can get for that. Why does the framework debate matter? I've mentioned this a couple times now. Yeah.
It's like you said, it's the lens for the judge, so it's kind of the negative way of saying this is your criteria for the ballot.
100%. Have to be able to get the judge to look at the debate through your own lens, or at least consider your lens. Because if you're not talking about it and the other team is, then at the end of the day, the judge should be looking through that lens, and it's probably not the lens that you want them looking through. Last thing we'll talk about are some tips for running a K. Your critique should be understandable and explainable to you. If this means on the car ride you get quizzed about what your K actually says with some evidence in front of you, or with the way in which you, I don't know how parliamentary debaters find their K arguments.
Make them up.
Yeah. Okay.
LB files.
Works for me. You should have someone quiz you about what the internals of that evidence says so you're able to answer questions. I don't think it will hurt the parliamentary debater to say an author in their arguments, right?
How do you deal with that as like a judge? Because like a lot of evidence has to be made up. You know what I mean? In the sense that in Parley you don't have to really cite anything. You know what I mean? You could be like, I read it on CNN today. Like,
I guess there's a difference between like a politics dissent and the K. Well, we're talking about like pretty big name philosophers who are making these discussions versus the politics dissent, which has a million different authors on any given day. Right? Like if I'm talking about capitalism, I could be talking about Zizek and Zizek specific. Or I could be talking about Marx and Marx specific. So I think that it's much easier to be able to make those arguments in Parley debate where it's like, you're answering this like it's a Marxism critique, but I'm answering it more, I'm giving you a Zizek critique. Right? The subtle differences probably get you a long way. And you should be able to explain the differences between those two things if you're going to make that argument. Tagging evidence strategically, and in Parley, I think this means offering a large overview about what you're going to talk about before you rant about it. Your evidence will be dense with words that no one will understand. The way in which you frame that piece of evidence or frame that specific argument matters. It's also what the judge is going to remember when he writes it down on his flow. Right? He's not going to write down the internals like a politics. But in politics dissents, right, our taglines are quick and dirty. It should not be the case necessarily with a K debate. They should have more impactful meaning, and they should take a little bit longer to be able to write. You need to take a lot of really complicated ideas and condense it down to a sentence. You should tailor your overviews, and there probably should be overviews when you read a K. This is the aha moment for a lot of judges, and this is where you get to clarify all the other things and put things into perspective. This is also where you get to do some impact analysis, which I think is really important for the K debate in terms of being able to say how you're going to either turn the app, become a prerequisite for the app, or how you actually get to your impacts faster. I think that's an important distinction to make about the K. It's something that should be highlighted. Use analogies. I don't have a good analogy. Sorry about that. You should use them though. Draw hard. So Sue's analogy for the counter plan was to be able to talk about going to the store, right? Or going to the movies. Lunch. Example changes. But you should be able to draw those kind of simple comparisons with your K. Apple today doesn't mean an apple tomorrow, something like that. And then you get to explain the analogy. Yeah.
So would you say you go into your analogy more in your PMC or the PMR?
PM, Prime Minister Constructive, is the second speech?
Yeah, the Prime Minister Constructive is the first speech in Parley. And
PMR is
the
the
rebuttal
final
is the
speech.
final speech of the round.
I think the analogy can be made in the second speech
Okay.
and then brought up again in the third speech. Because I think that it'd be good to know how the app wants to respond to the analogy. But I could also see you being right at the last speech, sort of as a summation.
Okay, but by PM, I'm sorry, I meant to say again, the negative.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm on board with the one.
Yeah.
The last speech, I think, is a fine place to read it, or the second is the last speech. Either or. It just depends on how good your analogy is, or if you think that you're losing that piece of paper, or the judge looks really confused, right? I think it's context driven. Because if you're saying a K and I don't agree with your K or it doesn't make any sense to me, I'm more likely to want to try and buy in if I can easily wrap my head around it. And the earlier you get the judge to get their mind wrapped around whatever argument you're making, the better off you'll be. Any other questions about the K? This is sort of a quick and dirty, let's talk about a lot of things and not go into a lot of depth.
I'm still not entirely clear. Like in the beginning, you were like, "This is cheating. This is not cool." But can I have some finality on what is, if this is cool or not for an LD round?
In LD round, it depends on what your alternative is. And it depends on if you're willing to have the debate about whether or not LD rules are stupid or not. Like, if you don't want to actually have a debate about the debate and you want to have a debate about the rules of LD, you can do that pretty easily. I don't think that's a very educational use of your time, and I don't suggest that as your coach. You shouldn't do that. But for everyone else, feel free. Have a debate about whether LD rules are stupid. Yeah.
I had a question. I know that there's been some before, and I'm kind of expecting more to be made, but there are themed Ks, like Ks about like Star Trek Ks. And from a judge's perspective, do those inherently contain less credibility because they're based off of?
No.
Okay.
The Star Trek K is an analogy
Right.
that someone has written to try and make it so some, like, what is it, probably like Heidegger?
I think so.
Yeah. To try and make that make more sense. Right? And the only way that we are able to do that is to draw comparisons from our own past. Right? So if the judge is a giant Star Trek fan at the back of the room, or even if they're not a giant Star Trek fan in the back of the room, they know what it is. Right? Hopefully we all know who Captain Kirk is. If we don't know who Captain Kirk is, go watch some Star Trek. But that's all it does. It just provides them with a different lens to be able to help you wrap your mind around those big words. But those were popular. My favorite app that I wrote a Batman app, which is basically a Batman critique, right? So.
What was the thesis? Like vigilantism?
Nuclear secrecy ban. The Dark Knight Rises just came out.
Right.
Any other questions?
You can run a Batman app, but we can't debate about the LD.
This was
rules.
policy.
Okay.
Different.
Well, I just, okay.
It's also my last turn. Be nice. All right.
So, I know we've had this conversation, but just to clarify a little more, you would argue if you frame it through a consequence lens that a reject app could be successfully run in LD.
I think the
Not to
reject.
reject alpha, reject K, sorry.
I think the reject the case argument in K rounds for LD is probably not falling under LD rules. Because if you reject the AF and your link is something like the state K, then you're proposing a different form of government, which goes against the rules. Oh, it's economic system or government agency. That's the LD rules. They basically say you can't run captures. Anything else? Thanks for your time. I don't know what your guys' next is.